Hey, welcome back to the fall premiere of Nerd Without a Herd. This is Jason Kleber, your host of the Vlogcast podcast that focuses on things that, well, frankly, I'm interested in. Things and people that I find fascinating and that have to do with education. So I haven't done a podcast since March or April, and there's a reason for that. It's not that I've been away as much as I've been silent. Dealing with distance learning, dealing with COVID, and everything was tough enough. But then when the murder of George Floyd occurred and the social unrest that followed, I just personally felt as a teacher, as an educator, and as an American, the last thing the world needed right now was another middle-aged white man speaking into the problems of this world. I really felt like it was my time to personally step back and listen, try to have empathy, try to have understanding, and hopefully be part of solutions rather than noise. And so as we come back here in the fall, the very first podcast I wanted to deal with this subject, but not with the politics, not with the division necessarily, but how do we as teachers, as educators, how do we help our young people, our students move from a place of anger to action? And so it made it very easy to find my guests for this podcast. The two teachers that I have brought in, I have known one for 7 years and one for 14 years. And the reason they're a part of this podcast is because I've seen them in their classroom model voice and awareness and empathy and action. And so instead of having a discussion that's going to hinge on division and tribal politics and fighting, I wanted people who would help us as educators see how we move our kids towards positive action, regardless of their political underpinnings. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Seta Ghazarian. I've worked with Seta since 2006. She is an English teacher, and she's also in the midst of a political campaign. So Seta, you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on with you right now?
So as Jason said, I'm Seta Ghazarian. I'm a 19-year teacher this year, but a first-year teacher like many with remote learning. And I'm also a local community activist and organizer, which really lit my fire to run for office. And I'm running to represent Area 1 of the Victor Valley Union High School District Board of Trustees.
And I also have with me a colleague of 7 years, Dennis Canady, a government econ teacher and also someone who's been very active in getting our students involved in positive ways. So Dennis, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I've been teaching for 16 years. This is my 16th year of teaching. I'm originally from Chicago, south side of Chicago, and I joined the United States Marine Corps. And from there, I worked at Honeywell Corporation for 17 years in corporate America before I got involved in education. And like Seta, I'm very passionate about my views and beliefs. I consider myself a social justice advocate, and I'm just involved and just willing to listen. I think that's important.
Well, and one of the reasons I chose both of you is because of your involvement and the things that you've done with students, whether through developing voice in writing or emailing their elected officials or volunteering at the polls. And so that leads me to my first question. And so I'll start with a set on this. How do we move our kids from drama to awareness? Because if we go online right now, whether it's as adults or kids, you bring up any hot button social political topic, there's plenty of hot drama out there. How do we as educators move them to becoming aware and not challenging their political beliefs or their parents, but really help them develop sound awareness?
I think for me as an English teacher, you start by having them write about it and express themselves or develop other alternative media, maybe Flipgrid videos, things of that nature, to just get their ideas out there and let them have that voice initially. And then in small groups, have those conversations and allow it to get a little uncomfortable. I think we learn from each other. We do that as adults. We should allow students to do that as well. We shouldn't underestimate them because of their youth. And with a little bit of guidance and direction in that journal writing or whatever project you happen to give them, with some benchmarks in place of what you want to see as the outcome and considerations of those opposing views, and then reworking that content to present it in a format that is going to be a tool for change, I think is where you begin. So it's a long process, but it really begins with initially letting the student have that voice and air their concerns and know that they're in a safe space. It takes a while to create that culture in the classroom of that safety, but once you get there, incredible things can happen.
So what about you, Dennis? What's your steps to empowering student voice?
Well, actually, yeah, I definitely agree with what Seta said. That's very important. I think it's about building relationships. It's very important that you build that rapport initially in the beginning, like the last week and a half or so. I've been doing that. I've been giving students the opportunity to share something about themselves. And, I want to know about their background, their likes, their dislikes, their family lives. We got, toward the end, there's another part of that essay that inquires about their social belief. Name one social belief that you're passionate about. So by setting that stage, it allows the students to open up and share a little bit about who they are and what they really feel strongly about, and their goals, short-term, long-term goals, and things of that nature. So I really find that that's a good way to get these kids talking and feel comfortable. I let them know who I am, my expectations, and things of that nature, and let them know that, hey, no one's here to judge you. I'm not going to judge you. I'm going to encourage you to be your real, authentic self. Okay, be you. That's my message. Be you.
And that's one of the reasons why I brought you guys in, because I know that you guys have never promoted your political agenda in the classroom. Even if there's a student that is polar opposite to what you guys believe, you promote them authentically having their voice. And I just appreciate and respect that. But that kind of leads me into my second part of this question. Sometimes as we start to encourage this place of empowerment and voice, we start to see that sometimes ideas are built upon fallacy or on pathos rather than logos, and this is some terms we talk about in English. So how do you guys get students not to question what they believe, but to really question the validity of their foundations in a healthy way, not to discourage their beliefs, but if anything to solidify them, but make them factual rather than I saw it on Facebook. Dennis, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And, it's very nuanced. I'll be honest with you. It's not something that's, generally black and white. So what I tend to do in those scenarios with those students, I want them to come in and, there's a lot of questioning, why is that? You want to prompt these young people to tell me why, okay? And then you can then look for ways to show them foundations and foundational approaches of where that derived from or where that came from. But the most important thing I always look at is to allow that voice to occur, allow it to happen, ask them why questions consistently and fairly, and let them know. The students have to understand again that it's not my agenda. You are not empty vessels for me to come in here and fill. So I'm going to set that aside. I tell students all the time, it's irregardless of where you are, you're not here to convince me, left, right, liberal, conservative, any of that. We're here to discuss issues. We're here to discuss, the origins of American government or economics and so forth. And I think once that level of trust is there, students will open up and they will share. And rarely, whether it be through emails or essays or writing, they feel comfortable and they trust the teacher, and the teacher is going to be fair. I think it's important that students know that you are going to be fair and judicious in your views and things of that nature. That's what I tend to focus on. Asking them why, asking them to see if they got some type of foundation or facts to go along with that.
So Dennis, there's a couple things that you bring up there that I want to touch on real quick. Number one, the trust, I think, is, and I've seen this, you build a culture of respect rather than an agenda. But also I love that kind of Socratic process of question, rather than, and I think it's a great model just for teaching in general, because it's that well, why do you believe that? Well, who said that? Well, what is their credibility? And what that does, that just gets the kids to look for themselves we're not telling them. They're discovering, and I think they're discovering how to think critically and look deeper. So Seta, same question. How do you address when you see stuff is built on passion or fallacy rather than...
Well, you said part of the word fallacy there, but very much like Dennis, I give them the why, and I tell them, tell me a little bit more about that. How did you arrive at that conclusion? And I allow them the space to walk through their reasoning, even if it's not grounded in reason. But I also encourage other students to speak up and have dialogue when somebody says something that is just completely based on misinformation like that. And of course, there's a huge part of my course is research and exploring logical fallacies and trying to get away from incorporating them into our writing, into our speaking, and so on and so forth. So that's one medium I use. And I also use the questioning method to kind of start planting the groundwork very early. For example, just today with my students, we were just brainstorming what is the American dream. And, the questions that were embedded in the lesson didn't necessarily call for it, but I like to start very early with them because that's my big overarching theme for the juniors at least. Is, well, does everyone have the same opportunity to achieve that? And what are some obstacles? If we're saying X is achieving the American dream, however they may define it, are some people further ahead in that process just by the mere circumstances of their birth? And of course, we break it down into young people lingo. And then we start challenging some assumptions there and engaging in that dialogue. There's a lot of conversation happening in my classroom. And I think just by the sheer makeup of our classes and our students, we get to that place of trying to be open to new ideas. Is every kid going to be open to a new idea? No. Some will push back. But, that's the work of the teacher to kind of keep trying to get them to that place where they're examining their own implicit biases. And sometimes something as simple as asking, well, if I substituted this group or this event, would you still see it that way? And then often that light bulb goes off of, you know what, that was the same thing, and yet we see that as a heroic act, and we see this as utter chaos and anarchy. So those are some ways that I approach things.
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about kind of leads me to something that is, I know, an underpinning of Dennis's class, empathy. And one of my focuses this year is looking at story in my English class, because story is so much more than just a list of fact. It is context. It is the people. It is their perspectives. It is the emotions, the timing. And I really feel like if we can sit down with someone, regardless of our political views, and understand their story and build empathy, that maybe we can start to close some of these gaps of division. Dennis, how important, again, you're a political science teacher, for lack of a better term, but how important is something like empathy to the process of understanding government?
It's huge. I mean, when you talk about government policies and social issues and even the origins of government, when you put down the perspectives of others and how other people view and see the world, it may not necessarily follow your own. It may not, you may be very distant from that particular individual culture. But the fact of the matter is, what we as humans, what can we do to make bonds, to make connections, to build bridges? And oftentimes I often tell young people, I say, you got to have empathy. Yes, you can talk about sympathy and, just feeling sorry, but empathy is reaching out and at least understanding, trying to put yourself in that situation. And I think, like Seta said earlier, these young people are pretty savvy. These young people understand, it might try to be it might take you a while to reach all of them, to get all of them to open up and embrace empathy, but it's there. And you as the educator, we as the educators have to continue to push at it and remind them when things are stated and throughout the session that we have. I remind students, I heard that Now let's go back and let's talk about how empathetic that was or unempathetic that may have been. So that's what we as educators, we got to hold these young people feet to the fire and say, hey, come on now. Remember what we said about empathy. It's not just a phrase you want to just, say. You want to try to live it and connect with it.
So this leads me to a difficult question. I'll start with Seta. Are you sensing amongst your kids a sense of hopelessness right now?
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the first journal responses we did with my freshmen was, the best and the worst part of quarantine, right? And they talked about that a little and explained why the best was the best and the worst was the worst. And they didn't really have a lot of the best part was very difficult for them. And, for me, I know what my best part is. It's more time with family, more time to read. But when we think about the circumstances that our students are in, those may not be outlets for them. In fact, those family, lack of resources may be the very things that are hindering them, most likely are, or creating trauma in their lives. And the school is that safe haven for them. So it is a very trying time for them. And we have to approach them with grace. I keep talking about grace in my class sessions every single time I meet with them, and just still trying to make those connections and just being very aware of the emotional space that they're in right now. And because of the pandemic, in a larger sense, getting outside of their home, there's a sense of hopelessness about the state of the country, but also the state of the world. A lot of them have mentioned how concerned they are about climate change and the fact that, the planet will be destroyed by the time they're my age. And that there's no turning back. And so, as Dennis pointed out, as I mentioned earlier, I think sometimes we underestimate these young people. They're paying attention. And I find them to be, overall, much more empathetic than the previous generation of students that I did teach. So I've now taught long enough to have taught 2 generations of students, and I'm seeing a difference. They're more empathetic and they're more civic-minded, which brings me a lot of hope for the future.
Yeah, and before I throw this question to you, Dennis, I just want to say I love working with young people, and when people non-colleagues say, "Oh my gosh, you work with kids today," it's like they don't know how amazing and creative. And they sometimes only see a media portion of kids and throw a blanket over them, but there are some amazing, talented, creative, dynamic, caring young people. But with that said, Dennis, I've had more students and former students tell me with a bit of serious air that hey, I don't know that I want to bring children into this world someday, and that breaks my heart. Are you seeing more than at any other time a sense of hopelessness among students and kids, looking at not just politics, but everything between COVID and politics and climate change, whatever it may be?
Well, yes, I reading the introduction essays from my students, there is some despair, and some of the students were more frank and transparent about it, talking about their personal lives and some of the things that they're feeling right now. It's kind of disheartening, to be quite frank with you, to read that. You want to, you're not there to, to give them a hug or attaboy as much. I mean, you can with your, I do with the writings and things on, with Word docs and what have you. But the thing that does get me when I read those things, when I see a student that is reaching out, that's really feeling kind of disconnected or feel despair, I've had one in particular, and I was just like, wow, the student, I just said, you know what, you're gonna just know that we're better than this. America's better than this. The world is better. We're gonna get beyond this time period. And I always remind them, guys, you understand something. We're the first. You're the first. All of us are the first. No one has lived the way we have lived at this date and time. with this type of pandemic, right? With the technology and the things that we are having to deal with. So I just remind students that, you know what, we're gonna get through this. As difficult as it may seem, and yeah, I heard some of those other things. You know, it's so much harder for us. The future is bleak, and sometimes, you know, I feel kind of, you know, reluctant to give them so much. I always remind my students, give them so much current events and media, because some of these kids are consuming this at such a rate. I said, self-regulate what you're consuming, because so much of it is negative. And so we definitely want to make sure that we remind them that you got to regulate how much of that information that you're taking in.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that. Part of my personal process of stepping back and listening was I stayed off social media for 40 days over the summer and just read the news. Oh my gosh, it just crushed me. Like, if you feed yourself a diet of nothing but news from legitimate news sources, it will crush your soul.
It will.
I was so glad to go back to social media just to see, you know, dogs and trophy trucks and mountain bikes to get some balance. And the reason I brought up the hopelessness, I don't want to, you know, promote this or promote negativity, but I think it's key for this, that if we look at that there is a potential sense of hopelessness, I believe as an educator, the power to combat that is voice and awareness. Mm-hmm. So if we as educators are promoting student voice, promoting authentic awareness, I think that's the best combat for what looks like a dreary or bleak world, because I am still a person filled with hope in the spirit I see in these kids, and I have great hope for the next generation. But that brings me to kind of the main point of this podcast. How do we help our kids move from just anger and frustration and hopelessness to action? I had a kid last year when we were talking about social change. He said, you know, Cleaver, that's great, but nothing ever changes. You can't make a difference in the world. I said, I would beg to differ. In my generation, there was a major change. When I was in high school, Apple Valley High School in 1986, we had a smoking section on campus for students and teachers.
Wow.
Not just that, but it's just a cultural attitude towards smoking when big tobacco companies ran just through nefarious means, you know, lobbying and whatnot. We saw massive political and social change. I can bring up, you know, homosexual marriage. So I can go back and I started listing all these things that changed from people, really from the grassroots. And he was like, oh, you're right. And so my point was to these young people, if there is something with this world that is clearly broken, there is a way to change it. So instead of just sitting and moaning and being negative, get up and go. And so that's why I'd like to first start with Seta. What are some ways that you encourage, or that we as teachers can encourage young people to move from anger to action?
Well, I guess I'll give you my specific example of exactly what I do in the class through the course of the year later. But you curriculum design in such a way to get them there. So, you know, you let them air their grievances, of course, in a safe environment. You create the safe environment. You let them air their grievances. We brainstorm solutions, and then we create a product, right? We create a product that becomes that tool for change, whether it's writing a formal letter to someone in a position that is in a position to make that change. Whether it's creating a direct action, you know, to actually address the issue. So that's one thing I do in my classroom is I have students study social movements throughout American history. So even though I teach English, you know, English 3 correlates with the U.S. history course. And so typically I'll find a U.S. history teacher to team up with and collaborate with, but that's not always due to scheduling possible. But they will study a social movement and present to each other. So they create these videos. And then the aftermath is to create a direct action of their own about an issue confronting society today where they would like to see a positive change. So, I mean, those are some specifics, but it's I think still those same blueprint to get you there.
Yeah, and if we look at some of the tools we have now, like change.org, there's nothing that prevents a 16-year-old kid from, you know, and I say kid because anyone under 30 is a kid to me. So 16-year-olds don't take that personally. But there's nothing to prevent them from impacting great social change just from their Chromebook. Dennis, what are some things that you do to move your kids from a position of frustration to actual action?
Well, the first thing I do is I model a positive attitude. I come in every day and I say, hey, what's going on? I try to come in there, high energy, positive perspective, because students are looking at us. We're the leaders. We're the role models. So if I come in, oh God, this, that, and the other, and everything is going to, in a handbasket. That's not the way we want to do it. So you want to start with, at least in my perspective, model the behavior. And then I go from there and I remind students. I have a quote up there this month on my webpage that reminds students, it was from former President Barack Obama, that says, be the change you want to be or you want to see. And so it's important that, yes, there's could be frustration and anger, and you want to remind students of what's next. What can you do? I was telling that to the young people today. Don't just sit back and say, woe is me. What is it that you can do? Okay, what can I do? And again, if you're going to, do the talk, you got to walk it too. Walk it like you talk it, right? And so you got to remind students everybody can do something. Every single one of us can do something. It may be small. You may think it's insignificant, but if we all took that approach, we can make change. And so again, just positivity. I know sometimes the glass half full may seem trite, but I tell you, that's where we got to go from. We got to build from positivity.
Right, and that direct action can be something as simple as helping them prep to speak at a school board meeting. They think they're powerless because they're not 18 yet in the student population that I teach. I know, Dennis, some of them get to 18 by the time they're done with you. And they think, well, I'm not legally an adult. There's nothing I can do. But there is so much they can do. And once you just kind of start rattling off examples, it's amazing how that just kind of catches fire. And they start thinking of examples that I've never even thought of.
Mm-hmm.
So that leads me to kind of one thing that I know is very important to both of you, and that's voting and the power of young people voting. A lot of them think that one vote doesn't matter, and they may look at the presidency as the end all be all. What they may not realize is how important local elections are and how that probably impacts us way more than a president does. Mm-hmm. So what do you guys do to encourage activity in that?
You give examples of just what you said. On the Apple Valley School Board last time around in 2018, the person that won one of the seats won by 6 votes. So there it is. You and 5 of your friends could make the difference about what the school board looks like and who's making decisions for your little brothers and sisters, even though you're graduating and moving on. So, that's a solid way. And as you know, Jason, I run registration drives on campus. I think that's going to look a little different this year because young people in California can now pre-register to vote at age 16. It's amazing. We're trying to make things better, and Prop 18 is going to be on the ballot this time around, which if it passes will allow those who are not 18 but will be by the time the general election rolls around to still vote in the primary for that particular race. So just telling kids these things and emphasizing the power of the vote, and as you said, how local leaders really shape what is happening in their daily lives is what gets you there. But it's the power of example. I truly believe in that.
Yeah, one thing we do in my English classes, I'll teach them how to go through and read ballot language, so that, there's all these commercials that are bombarding you, and we'll look at how they're specifically designed, to manipulate, and then we'll go, how do you break down ballot language? How do you get to what, the nuts and bolts of it is? And then you decide for yourself, but at least you're deciding from the nuts and bolts of it, because sometimes what it appears in the title isn't what it is in the language. And so that's one thing I encourage them to do. And when they start to feel like, hey, I know a little bit more, I think they feel more encouraged to then go do something with that vote. So Dennis, we only got a few minutes left. What do you do to encourage kids to become active voters?
Yeah. Quickly, I'll just say pretty much Seta touched on it, and so have you. It's again about showing them the school board process, right? And taking it from the local level always to the highest level, to the president. From the lowest level of government to the highest level of our government. I just remind them that we're going to engage with them. And also, like you said, Jason, I get the pamphlets that break down the propositions. I let them know how you're being affected by this or what the impact could be. So you just give students realia. You let them know that these things that are happening on TV with these 30-second campaign bites and ads, they could be misleading. You need to do more homework. You need to go and glean and find out more. Don't just settle on the quick sound bite. Sometimes those things is not enough, and it's only trying to get your attention in the cheapest way, just to lock you in. Well, you got to still do your research and your homework.
Seta, final word?
I think Dennis summed it up wonderfully, but I know Dennis and I are two people that are going to keep on keeping on with registering young people to vote.
Absolutely.
Developing their critical thinking skills so that they can wade through all of the noise on social media and get to the truth, and then exercise that at the ballot box or by showing up in their communities.
Yep.
Well, as a typical nerdy English teacher, I was taking notes while this was going on, and a couple things that really popped out at me I just want to highlight in closing. Trust and relationship, so important as educators. When kids come in loaded with all this angst about what's going on in the world socially, politically, with disease, whatever, it's through trust and relationship, knowing that they have authentic voice, knowing that they are going to be heard, knowing that they can air their feelings. That is the first step towards moving towards empathy and grace, some words you guys pointed out. And the safe environment then leads us to an action, whether it's, as Seta pointed out, products that help them move forward, or whether it's becoming involved in voting, presenting at the school board. I know Dennis also has his kids become poll workers, which I think is important. I think going to the poll on election day and seeing an 18-year-old and an 88-year-old casting a ballot really represents what makes America great. And I think getting young people to do that is so powerful.
And attending the school board meetings and the city council meetings, my students do that.
And I know when you have your students write senators or school board members, they come into my class so excited that hey, they sent me back a response.
They do.
And they just realize that their voice does matter. And doing homework and research, critical thinking skills, getting to the truth versus all the noise. I think there's been a lot of teachers in this climate the last few months that have been kind of scared. What am I going to do when we come back to school? How do I address this? I think you guys have laid out a beautiful blueprint here for how do you really take some difficult things going on in society, bring it into the classroom. And the only thing I see you guys promoting is critical thinking and voice, and everyone having their own opinion rather than an agenda. And I appreciate you guys coming on and talking about this topic with me, giving us hopefully something as educators to move this process forward. And I just think it's a blessing for our students to be able to have teachers like you just guiding them through this process of growing up in a world that we face today. So thank you again very much.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you for having me and for giving me the opportunity, and with my good friend Dennis.
That's right, Seta.
All right. This is Nerd Without a Herd with Jason. Until next time, stay safe out there, keep your face covered, and always seek the truth.